So the iconography that you borrow from matters because it's a way of expressing feelings, emotions, and even story elements without having to say anything, without having to have actual dialogue happening. When we see the imagery of Ben finding Rey dead, giving his life, they share a kiss, and now he's dead, it's invocative of Romeo and Juliet imagery, like we see right here. She finds him dead, and then we all know how it ends. Romeo and Juliet both end up dead, and it's just this tragic love story. The tragedy of it all was that they were never able to really be together, even though they did share a love for one another. Based on the iconography alone, it's clear that J.J. Abrams is trying to tell us this. Rey and Ben, yes, they do love each other, but due to their circumstances, due to the war, due to his past, maybe her past, they're never going to have their long last forever kind of love. They had a moment, and that's all they'll ever have. But just speaking as a person who has taken the time to really do some research on these characters and really become attached to these characters, I feel like adding the iconography of a Romeo and Juliet onto Rey and Ben feels like a hollow comparison, and I will explain why. So in the story of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo is a Montague, Juliet is a Capulet. They are two people who are attached unwillingly to a disagreement between families. They are merely innocent bystanders to the feud between their families. They see each other and immediately fall in love with each other. They don't have to learn how to love each other. They already feel it instantaneously as soon as they see each other. They have differences, but the differences that they do have are outside of themselves. They do not have any internal differences. They do not play to the larger dynamic and political aspects of their family's feuds. So when it comes to Rey and Ben / Kylo Ren, they first meet and they do not fall in love with each other. It is a love that has grown over time, where they had to get to know one another, and they had to get past any sort of prejudice and just learn to love and care for who they are at the core of their being. And that's not the case for Romeo and Juliet. Rey and Kylo Ren play a very big part in communities that they're associating themselves with. Rey associates herself with the Resistance. Kylo Ren associates himself with the First Order. And that is just such a big aspect of their identity, of who they are, and that's not something that they're willing to set aside. They're not passive players in the dynamics of the communities that they have chosen to attach themselves to. So speaking of Rey and Kylo Ren having pride and prejudice towards each other, I would say their romance is far more evocative of Pride and Prejudice. Quickly recapping some of the things that I've seen on YouTube from channels like Girls with Sabers and Star Wars Connections. But this is just a very quick recap on why a lot of us feel the way we do about Kylo Ren and Rey's romance. We have Mr. Darcy, who is of privilege and wealth, and his main characteristic is that he's very arrogant, he's very snobby, he's pretty rude. And we have Elizabeth Bennet, who is of a lower status, who does not have wealth and connections in the way that Mr. Darcy does. She is from, a humble upbringing and is far more simple than Mr. Darcy. So when Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet meet, they have differences towards each other. He thinks basically she's what would modernly be called country bumpkin, and, thinks she's very low class and is essentially just extremely prejudiced towards her. Then Elizabeth, picking up on the fact that he is an arrogant snob, refuses to see Mr. Darcy as anything but an arrogant snob because of all the prejudice that he had placed on her before. So her pride is no longer allowing her to see him for anything other than an arrogant snob. And it can be argued, and I'm sure it already is, that at some point she's the one who has prejudice and he's the one who's prideful, and vice versa, vice versa. Essentially, pride and prejudice are constantly getting in the way of them being able to see each other for the core of their being. Essentially, at the end of all of it, they are able to put aside the pride and prejudice that had kept them from seeing each other for the core of their human selves. And when they do that, when they set aside the pride and prejudice for one another, they're able to fall in love. To me, this feels a lot more like Kylo Ren and Rey. Kylo Ren is a privileged, pompous little brat who thinks he's better than everyone else. When he first meets Rey, he's pretty arrogant with her. He calls her this scavenger girl and tells her at some point that she has no right participating in all of this because she's essentially no one. And she refuses to see him as anything more than Kylo Ren, the evil guy who is at some point going to run and be the head of the First Order. She just sees him as a monstrous snake and as just a total bad guy who is not worthy of her time. Eventually, at the very, very end of everything, they're able to put all of that aside because in their heart, in the core of their being, they feel like they're truly connected. They have this really intense force connection. When they actually sit down and talk with one another and are not fighting, they realize that they have a lot more in common. They're able to connect with one another. And when they speak and spend time with one another, they don't feel so alone in the world. They feel like they've met someone who understands them in a way that no one else has. Well, spoiler alert for anyone who doesn't know, Pride and Prejudice does not end in one of them dying. It ends with them getting married and starting a family.